I am Julie Phelps. I'm the Artistic and Executive Director of Counterpulse. I'm also one of the instigators and a participant in the Grand Reunion Project. I'll be facilitating today's discussion. So I believe that those of us who believe the arts are a site of transformational experiences, personal development, and connection to community, we have a deep responsibility to engage the idea of access and how the arts field may be reinforcing or disrupting harmful patterns of exclusion, inequity, and homogenization at large. I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to the panelists and get them introducing themselves. So if each of the panelists can unmute and say your name, your pronouns, where you're calling in from, and a little bit about your background. And Alice, we'll start with you.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Alice Shepherd. I am a disabled dancer and choreographer. I am visually recognizable today as a light-skinned or perhaps coffee-colored skinned, depending on how you place the worth of skin color in the hierarchies and politics and troubled history of race and in the United States. But for myself today, I will say I'm a coffee-colored, capital B, Black woman. I'm calling to you from the land of the Muwekma Ohlone, which is south of San Francisco and is the site of my home, a place of people who are struggling for federal recognition as a nation, and whose work I will support. I am today, for visual purposes, I will give an identification of the circumstances which I'm sitting, a room with a series of performance posters in the background. And for visual identification, I am wearing a headset with microphone and a light gray sort of mottled striped hoodie. Yeah, I would say you can find me on the web dancing, and you can find my writing on the web and in journals. And one day soon, you will find me on stage, and I hope I will see you there too. I pass now to Jenny.
Hi, thank you. And thank you to Julie and Counterpulse for organizing this and bringing us together. I'm looking forward to the conversation today with Alice and Craig. I'm Jenny Bearden. I pronouns she, her, and I am speaking to you from San Francisco, which is my home. And I am a professor of sociology at UC Santa Cruz and the director of the Science and Justice Research Center. I guess important for this conversation also is that I began my life really as a scientist very early on, and had a laboratory in my basement. I was one of these crazy people who started science very young and went into genomics. And that's going to be, I think, important to the conversation because my background is very much influenced by someone who was concerned with questions of access into fields of science, particularly around in genomics. But I think also something that's relevant here is the way that genomics as a field, and I think might be something that we'll talk about today, affects what kinds of bodies can be in these spaces. And in genomics, the questions are around genetics, but that then relates to questions of what kind of corporeal bodies occupy social spaces, including all kinds of societal institutions. So I'll be bringing that perspective together, but I'm excited about this conversation that's going to bring us some very different perspectives together. So, and with that, I'll turn it over to Craig.
All right, thanks, Jenny. And I'd also like to say thank you to Julie and to Counterpulse for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm very excited to be able to discuss this. And again, as Julie said, we're not here as experts. I'm here as somebody who has a particular thought pattern based on experiences and certain training, but I think it'd be really nice to engage with people and see how we all come together on this issue. And so to tell you a bit about my background and the way that I will be thinking and discussing access today. So I'm a Jamaican neuroscientist. I was born in Kingston, Jamaica, moved here to the US for college long time ago now. But I started studying neuroscience and psychology in undergrad, and I've been doing that ever since. And that has culminated in me doing doctoral level and postdoctoral level work in academia, in psychology and neuroscience, doing MRI-based imaging modeling, so using brain modeling to connect the brain phenotypes or the patterns that we see in the brain with disease states, but also with people's cognitive states in general, in their emotional states. And I'll touch on that and why that helps to frame my concept of access from a psychological and neuroscientific perspective. And so for me, a big thing that now is kind of where I'm at in my career is thinking a lot about practical considerations around access to mental health and just healthcare resources in general. And in my current role, that's one of the things that I'm trying to explore in terms of how do we get people to get the right information and the right treatment before it's too late. Usually we're intervening, the interventions are at a point where people are already suffering. How do we not have people suffer and get them to get the information they need and want? And also, how do we help them choose how to engage with that information as well? So that's one of the things that I'm currently grappling with, and I'd love to discuss here in terms of the larger implications. And yes, I guess that's my introduction. I'll stop there and then maybe be more pointed when we start answering questions. So I'll pass it back to you, Julie. You're muted, Julie.
Thank you again for being here. I'm just going to get the first question on the table. So starting kind of zoomed out, what is access? How or where does the idea of access come up in your field of practice at large? Would anybody electively begin, or I can pass the ball? Alice, maybe we can hear from you first, because I feel like the background of your practice could come into view a little bit more.
Thank you, Julie. Wow. Hi, Jenny. Hi, Craig. I wanted to start. Thanks for waving back. Yeah. Let's start with what I think of as the most painful, and I'm going to get into it straight away. I'm going to start with the bit that I think of as most painful, most frustrating, and simultaneously most beautiful and rewarding and generative. So let's start with, I don't have time to mess around, and I want to go to the core and put the problem on the table. In my left hand, I hold access, and I'm raising my hand in a sort of kind of cup, as if I were holding a plate or a waiter, like a waiter. In my left hand, I encounter access as a deficit model of services. That is, as a disabled person, I am required
Alice, we've lost you.
world. So, for example, I am.
Sorry, Alice, can I interrupt? We lost you there for a second. The last thing I heard, that it's a deficit model and that I, as a disabled person, I don't think we got anything past that.
I hope my internet stabilizes.
It's better now.
Great. What I was referring in my left hand encounters the deficit model of access, a series of services, ASL interpretation, captioning, ramps, or curb cuts, or elevators, or things, audio description, things that I am offered as a disabled person that are supposed to enable me to cross the gap between disability and the non-disabled world. And in the arts right now, people are just beginning to try and figure out that this stuff should be happening. Frankly, people, I want to say I'm frustrated. It's the law over here in the US. It's also part of the law in the UK. It's part of a human rights convention that governs Europe. This is fundamental. And frankly, as an artist, however, it's boring. It is minimally compliant with the law. It is necessary. But as an artist, that's not where I want to be. As an artist, access is fundamental to community. Access is how we relate to each other. Access is generative in the work. It's not a matter of describing the work once the work is done. It's not a matter of sticking an ASL interpreter in the top of a window of a screen. It's not a matter of adding captions later once the thing is being broadcast. Access is how I relate to you as an audience member and to the artists on stage. Access is how I create dance and video. Access is generative and creative. It drives the world that I live in. So my right hand, which is this generative creative hand, is excited by where I can go as an artist, thanks to the formulation and the work of the disability justice leaders. Access in the left hand is what people expect and offer. And so my world is in tension between the generative and creative work that I want to do as an artist and the kind of deficit understanding of the non-disabled world in the arts and in society at large. I wish we were all on the right-hand side. Thank you for letting me start.
Thank you, Alice. Craig, why don't we move to you?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. And I think a lot of what you said is so interesting, Alex, because I have very similar conceptualizations of access, but I think that obviously, you know, I'm not a choreographer, I'm not engaging in the same way, perhaps physically, but I think that for me, a lot of what I think about is actually very relevant, particularly certain snippets of what you said, and I'll get to that in a second. But I guess just to zoom out for me, you know, there's a lot of ways, you know, that in the field of study that I'm in, neuroscience and psychology, that access comes up either directly, you know, explicitly or implicitly. And I wouldn't dare to say that I could kind of cover the breadth of that in this conversation or ever, maybe. Nor am I expert enough, or know anybody would be probably to be able to speak on all these topics. So, you know, for me, I wanted to like think about how to ground this and how I approached it by looking at actually the Merriam-Webster definition of it. And so I looked it up, and it's, you know, for me, what I saw was permission, freedom, or ability to enter, approach, obtain, or make use of something is one definition that I anchored on. And for me, you know, that's very relevant to two aspects of what my life or my career has kind of shown me, the two sides of this concept, and very similar to what Alice has brought up. So one is a more academic kind of enterprise, which is, you know, I've studied a lot of how do we access our thoughts, our cognitive processes, our brain processes, our emotions, even explicitly things that then, you know, for instance, as Alice was saying, as a creative or creator, you know, how do you engage with the audience, right? So one thing I've studied is theory of mind, which is literally how do you take on the perspectives of other people. That's a kind of psychological and neuroscientific concept, right? And so the parts of the brain that light up when you see something modeled by somebody else, or when somebody engages with you in a certain way, or when you try and think about somebody else. Into the kind of colloquial way to think about it is putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, right? So why does that matter, right? That matters because that, to me, is, for instance, one example of access not only to yourself and to your own metacognitive processes and your own emotions, thoughts, but it's also the access to the other person, right? You know, the idea of theory of mind, you know, the idea of perspective taking is some way that we have evolutionarily learned how to access each other, right? And each other's thoughts and emotions. So that's one thing I've studied and I feel comfortable speaking on. I think that has obviously a lot of implications in this conversation. And for me, also specifically thinking about access to emotion, that one piece, and how we deal with our emotions, how are we dealing with, say, for instance, COVID, and how do we deal with it on our own versus with each other? How do we deal with it in terms of what strategies do we use to try and get through a very difficult situation or to change how we feel about a particular situation? And how we access that is entirely dependent on what we've been taught that we should or are able to do in terms of our cognitive and emotional capabilities, right? So a lot of men are not taught to access emotion in a certain way, and that can actually have a huge impact on how they live their lives and how they kind of interact with other people. And so for me, and so by men, I mean, male-bodied people, so just probably use that term, but, in that kind of general gendered kind of conceptualization, there are, psychological and neuroscientific implications for, how we access our emotions and how we access each other. And, taking that outside of that specific example, just in general, access to these kinds of concepts is really the fundamental, like, kind of foundation of our entire existence, like how we are able to kind of navigate the world in our kind of conscious experience, right? And so I think to the extent to which we can explore that fundamental concept, I think it's really related exactly to what you're saying in terms of community building, right? It's exploration of the factors that influence our dynamics and our communities, really. And the last thing I'll say is, if we have time, I want to talk about the practical side, which I think was the left hand that Alice was talking about, which is who has access to study and engage with certain types of institutions and certain types of concepts. So, being in academia, I was very aware of what the narratives were, like who set these tones about certain concepts, who was able to get grants to study certain things, and who wasn't, right? And who, as a result of my work doing mental health research and healthcare innovation in general, who is able to actually engage with that, right, from a practical standpoint in terms of financial resources, but also just exposure and things like that. So that's another thing I think a lot about on the kind of non-academic side, which is I really want to focus on that for the rest of my career, which is making sure people have access to the rights, things that they deserve as human rights, which is healthcare, for instance, right? That's a very important one for me. So that's one thing on the in terms of the deficit side that I really see a huge deficit across all intersectional categories, actually, to be honest. Like in the US, for instance, we have a pretty bad healthcare system and we need better access to these services. And I think that's one thing that I think a lot about and hopefully can put in context in this conversation.
Well, I want to try to keep my comments. We're trying to do a very broad and important discussion in a very short amount of time. So I'll try to keep to just a few minutes here, but I just want to amplify a few things and connect to a few things that Alice and Craig said, that in terms of how access comes up in my field. What Alice had to say about the laws are not enough. We need to be, we need to, and they're not being followed. That's also true in my field, and they're not enough. And what I'm interested in is really moving beyond what was codified as what we've accepted as a society to be what we should all follow, which are the laws, to be pushing at the edge of that, to be thinking beyond that. And that's where the creative space of access comes in. What Craig brought up around even just stumbling over this word of male, like what do we have access to? It depends on the architecture of the door that we're going through, which concepts construct those doors, and male and female, of course, are a part of that architecture that enables what we have, what kinds of doors we're given the entree to. So I'm interested in actually reconfiguring the door and not so much in who goes through it, but what kind of doors are there. And I think that gets to the point of what we talked about in a pre-conversation was when I was surprised when I looked at the etymology of the term of access, that it actually has this quite striking origin in the 14th century from the Old French, which means an onslaught, an attack of an illness. So it's actually quite a violent thing, access. And I think that I think it's important that we get that on the table, because often access is seen as this nice civilized thing that we do, that we like we're taught to open doors for people. That's a quite gracious thing to do, but actually it's often a quite contentious thing, because what we're needing to do to really transform a space so it really is accessible for a more diverse range of human lives is to take down the door. And often people are invested in that door standing up, so it can get very contentious very quickly. And in my own line of work, coming into science in the 1980s, as I was part of the Women in Science movement, that was back when we were concerned about women. In the 90s, we would move to people of color. That would be the emphasis. But for me, it was all about getting women in. And I remember standing up at a national meeting, the American Association for the Academy of Sciences Association, as a professional society for all the sciences. And there was a Women in Science meeting. And the discussion was how to get more women into science. And they were putting all these statistics up about how we were breaking all these boundaries in terms of how many women there are. And I stood up and said, okay, that's how many women there are in science. The question I have is how many women will stay in science? And I see that my time is now up. So I'll leave it there and pass it along.
Excellent. I'm just going to add in the next question to keep with the spirit of just bringing in ideas. Though actually we did agree that if you all wanted to have any crosstalk in post question that we would do that. Yeah, so I'm remembering now. Alice?
I do want to do that. And I know
Yeah.
time is of a premium. I want to go one step further on you, Jenny, and be like, let's take the door down and let's not care about who goes through the door. But the problem with that I find that we get stuck, right? Because it goes to your question about who stays in science, right? The problem about the door is that separate is not equal. So you can take down all the doors, you can blow holes in the walls to keep the metaphor going, but the experience of coming in the door is what matters to me. When I think about wheelchair access, I always talk about this with the example of a wheelchair access ramp, so I can get into the building. The ramp is there, that's great. But who cares? Does that ramp encourage me to kiss a lover? No. Everybody else is having an incredible experience of architecture and culture. And I get to go up a metal ramp that is kind of added on retroactively. So it's the question of, yeah, there's a door. Yeah, you can get in. But who cares if you're not investigating in the same culture and experience and the aesthetic and the politic of entrance? Who stays in science? How do we go through the door matter as much as whether the door is there or not? I mean, that's, to me, I don't ever want to get stuck in the world of inclusion. I want to think about the world of equity, which is what your question is leading to. And I think we are stuck that inclusiveness is actually more divisive than it is in terms of justice. Inclusion reinforces hierarchies. Who stays in science? What happens after you get access to the mental health services? How do you live, participate? How do you flourish? These are the questions that I want. These are the questions that I think about as access. Yeah.
Do you mind if I add on to that? So I think that one of the things that I think a lot about, and I think that this is again kind of less practical but more fundamental, kind of like one of the substrates, is when you think about inclusion, you know, I think from the individual level, your example was beautiful in terms of the ramp and like this kind of facade of inclusion, right? And part of what I think was unsaid was the reason why you don't have the impetus or the feeling like you would have this same level of like full experience to go and kiss your lover, and the way that people have this like large dynamic life versus this kind of like almost perfunctory kind of version of inclusion, to me it really speaks to access from the psychological perspective versus or via agency, right? So agency as a construct. Now I'm thinking about like who believes that they have the right to live and flourish in this space, to move through the space freely, right? And I think that that's a really, really powerful, and like very like deterministic factor in terms of who enters certain spaces, you know, who goes to certain theaters, who, you know, enrolls in certain universities, who feels that they can speak up in certain situations. And so that version of access, to me, you know, we talk about tearing down the doors. I agree that it's not enough to reshape or tear down the door. You have to reshape the whole space so people feel welcome, so feel they have agency, right?
I want to go back to that, you know, that violent origin of that word access, because there's a way in which I totally agree with Alice and Craig on this point about inclusion is not the right paradigm, because often inclusion can be itself violent. If you include someone without changing the space to make it a space where someone can flourish, then, and if you're asking them to leave who they are at the door, as in once, as Alice put it, what is it like to go through the door? Do I have to leave who I am behind once I get inside that space? Which is often what happens in science, is that, you know, we quite explicitly ask people, I mean, it's part of the methodology of science, like leave all of your cultural, everything about who you are, because we're all then just going to be human in this space, right? We're all just going to be objective humans in this space. But we know that's not true. We know from decades of research into how science functions that the questions it asks, the practices it uses, are absolutely culturally and politically inflected.
Who gets the grants, to Greg's point, yeah.
Absolutely. So that becomes where it starts to get really, it's beyond who did you give the fellowship to? It's once you've given the fellowship, what kind of fellowship is created? You know, and that is the work that institutions, I think, are very poor at doing. And I just want to give one call out to my colleagues, Kim Tallbear and Ripon Molly, who have started this SING program, which is a summer program for Indigenous genomics. So it's about making a different kind of genomics where the cultural practices of Indigenous peoples are fundamental to the science and don't have to be left at the doors of the genomics laboratory. So that's the kind of work I think it needs to be done.
Yeah, this is Alice again. I love that. I love that. And so that prompts me to say, right, if you, from my point of view, if out there you are a non-disabled creator of art, any kind of art or artist experience, my question to you is, a quarter of your audience is disabled. What have you done to make your work accessible? When you crafted that experience, when you crafted that work, how did you decide to think about sharing that work with a quarter of your audience with regard to disability? What did you decide to do about it? How did that influence your creative process? How do people live inside your work?
Wow, it's really, really fascinating. Counterpulse recently launched something called the Dramaturgical Council around not just deciding which stories get told, but, you know, not who's sitting at the table, but how the table is built, I guess, is a way I've been thinking about it. This understanding of the door and whether it's there or not, but also how it feels to move through it, and what happens once you're inside. And I think, you know, for me, and one of the reasons I've chosen the arts is that's culture to me, like, because that space isn't a room, right? It's a feeling, and yeah, So thank you for those reflections. I'm going to move on to the second question. So the second question is, does access have an assumed or explicit direction? Along which lines does it travel? Jenny, why don't we start with you this time?
Okay. So this one's interesting because I think in the field that I have spent, I guess, three decades studying either as a participant in genomics or as someone who studies it as a historian and a sociologist, the lines on which it's supposed to travel is, of course, all humans. I mean, the whole thing about the genome is it's supposed to represent all human beings. But what we see in practice that, along what lines it practically travels, it does travel to exclude in particular ways. Most of the DNA that we have in our collections are primarily from are from what the categories that use are white and European. And again, I think that's part of what has to be, reworked here in order to truly make an accessible genomics, is to look at that, my stumbling over my language. But interestingly, we could say, okay, so the answer to that is, let's include all of these, people who are non-white into genomics. But unfortunately, when you do that, the lines continue to exclude people, because when you include, in this case, what often happens is that the experience once you get in is another form of exclusionary force. So for example, there are many examples of the way in which DNA is used to exclude, going back to the sickle cell testing that was done in the 1970s that excluded people from jobs, to the surveillance that's happening right now in China of ethnic minorities, that is being used to oppress those populations. And unless we start looking at those issues, efforts to reroute genomics continue to bring it back to what it was originally doing. So this just goes back to our first conversation about how we need to rethink, what access is as it's not just a set of ideas. It's material practice. It's building a world, and unless you start building differently, the routes are gonna keep swerving back to being exclusionary.
Craig, do you want to come in second?
Yeah, sure. So I think for me, the examples I wanted to give here in terms of psychology and neuroscience, again, it's a broad space, and I think that, access could be a component of almost all psychological and neuroscientific concepts, right? Because if you think about access as agency versus attribution versus any of the other concepts that one could kind of define this with, there's so much there, and then it's so fundamental. But I think, going back to something I touched on earlier, in terms of who feels that they have the right to enter a space. There's work before my current job now, I worked doing research in psychology and neuroscience at Stanford, and I worked with colleagues there and had a chance to chat with folks who are doing social psychology research. And one of the things that really struck me was how much our kind of biases or implicit associations or implicit prejudice shapes our beliefs about ourselves, and we don't actually have access to the understanding that this is what's happening for us, right? This is happening to us in a way, but we're the ones doing it to ourselves, right? But most people don't really understand that, and then the kind of effect of that is that the people who you interact with, when you're not aware of how you're interacting with them in certain ways, they get affected, by your actions. And so very explicitly, one researcher, Jennifer Eberhardt, studies the intersection of many different forms of racial biases, but particularly in terms of the perception and reaction to Black people, and say, for instance, Black men, and whether or not you would see something in somebody's hand and think it's a gun, which very specifically is related to, for instance, police brutality and the killing of unarmed Black men, right? And the thing is, most people actually think that when they kind of immediately assume when they see a picture of a man holding something that, especially in a certain pose, but even not necessarily, but just in general, that's a Black person versus a white person, they assume that it's a gun, right? And that's something that's been borne out across race, actually, across any other intersectional category. That's just one of our implicit associations that we make based on all of the context of the culture that we've been taught to believe certain things around, say, criminality and violence in the Black community, right? And so for me, when I think about access, I think about like, how do we change the way in which we unconsciously tap into these associations, these biases? You know, how do we then change the way that people who are affected by them are able to engage with us and with the society as a whole, right? And that was one thing I wanted to start by saying, and then bring it back to a second thing in terms of the access to our cognitive and emotional space and the idea of affordances, because the idea there very simply is that part of the way in which we engage with emotion and our cognition is through basically a tool set, so to speak, right? Like how many tools you have in your toolbox to be able to engage. And the more that we are able to teach ourselves to access things that, you know, may be uncomfortable, but are ways in which that we are acting in the real world and ways in which our worldview is formed, that will help us kind of in this theme of community building to have more affordances for engagement with people in more truthful and actually equitable and positive ways. So that's one of the ways in which I think about access and the ways in which it travels in these spaces in terms of my work.
Thank you. Alice?
This is Alice. Thank you. Big question. When I looked at this the first time around, I just kind of splatted because it was a complicated question that I had such a strong emotional reaction to, because I live in such closeness and tension to the ways in which access is imagined. Access is imagined is imagined at large as a service from non-disabled people to disabled people, with that kind of hierarchical perspective. It is, and so here's an example about how I think about that in my world. If friends of mine want to go to a show, they have to give 2 weeks notice in order to get an ASL interpreter. Or if you want to go to a show, an ASL interpretation is only offered on Thursday nights, and you have to work Thursday nights. You know, it is offered as a kind of service, with the corollary in imagination. And here's my left hand again: that access is expensive, and the access is a burden. And so this is kind of world that I live in, where people both feel like they've earned brownie points for making sure that there's a captioner on Zoom, but they also kind of grumble in the background about how expensive the captioner is, but at least the captioner is cheaper than the ASL interpreter. And then they've done their job and they've transacted it and they've held access, and now a disabled person can do this. They can come to the show, they can get in the door. You've put down your $50 for the ramp. And so my world is both in this left-hand practical way, a recognition that access is a transaction and a burden, and yet the performance of access, what I would call the performance of discriminatory and inclusionary access, allows people to have the feeling that they have been a good citizen in the world, even though they have created an inequitable experience. And so again, I say that sucks. And I am disinterested in that. And I don't care how much access costs. Access cannot be transacted. In my world, my personal world, as a human and as a creator, access is much more hierarchical. Parallel, flat, not non-hierarchical. It is in the crafting of a theatre experience. It is in the welcoming. It is in the information that goes out, the shaping of even the writing of the invitation to come to the show, the expectation that you can come regardless of cost or price. It is in the welcoming of you at the door and in the ushering of you to the appropriate bathroom, to the appropriate seat, to where you can sit of your own choice, not as wheelchair users have to do in so many theaters where there's a cutout at the parallel edges by which you are architecturally marginalized. Even if you got on the door, you have to sit at the back row on the edge of the seating. You know, it is in the welcoming. It is in the spaces you get access to. It is in the work itself, and that is, and then it is in the goodbye. It is in the journey home. It is in the conversations had afterwards. It is in the connection and the relationship that I have as an audience member and as an artist. Access is the invisible filament that connects us. Yeah, end thought.
There was a lot there, Alice, that was really interesting. But I guess one question I'd have in response to what you just said is, if access is all simultaneously what connects us and the invisible filament, but also architecturally, institutionally exclusionary, how do we reconcile that?
I love that, Craig. Thank you. So this is why I feel like there's so much heat and energy and charge for me in this conversation, because that my lived experience is a way of reconciling that. So, for example, when I get to go on stage, I've been really lucky, or not lucky. I've worked really hard with venues and presenters to remove seating so that the seating doesn't discriminate. And so I shape the spaces that I perform in. And I craft that. I try to re-architect that. I figure out who's on staff and who is in the volunteers, and we re-sign and reassign the bathrooms, and we reform the invitations, and my experience is in that reconciliation. That is part of the work that I do that connects us in this way. And let me also be very frank with you. I fail every time. There is no right answer. There is only the work and the promise to do it better next time, or more solidly next time. You never get it right. And
I think that last point, Alice, about failure is really important. I think there's, and you sort of referenced this earlier, people who want brownie points. I mean, I think that we need to move off this as a space of the good and more into the space of the friction and the work of living together, which is an ongoing project in which we will always be excluding. And the issue is our ability to respond to that. I mean, this is a formulation I love and take from my colleagues Donna Haraway and Karen Barad, this notion that responsibility is the ability to respond. And when we get this whole area so caught up in a kind of liberal moral space, then people's feelings get hurt too easily, and maybe, and then they'd want to run away, or they feel like you didn't appreciate what they did and they tried, and et cetera. And or you end up being, construed as being, ungrateful or angry or mad or any of these other things, right? And that's a liberal space of affect that is making it hard to do the work of truly creating an accessible spaces, which are ongoing projects. There's no such thing as the accessible space. No one's ever going to get that right. It has to be, I think, always aspirational, always like a process. You know, when I run a center on science and justice, and people always ask us, well, what is justice? Then, well, it isn't any one thing. It is an ongoing project, and it is exclusionary. So, and I think the last thing I wanted to say is, Alice, I love your formulation of discriminatory access. I think that we need to remind ourselves that access discriminates. It always does. I don't think there's any form of access that isn't discriminatory. But the issue, I think, is how do you become accountable for the kinds of forms of discrimination that you've created? And that's, I think, what we should be aspiring to, is the ability to be accountable and to able to respond to those exclusions.
At least it's a step in the journey. Craig, is there anything else that you wanted to bring in on the second question?
No. Thank you for asking, though.
All right, I'm going to get the third question on the table. So the question is, what are the mechanisms, methodologies, or formats of access? Maybe a simpler, more accessible way of asking that might be, how does access work? Which I think is an interesting segue from the conversation of access being process, it being the work. Craig?
Yeah. So I'm going to switch away from, I think I've been talking a lot about the kind of academic, emotional, cognitive space a lot. And for this question, I thought it was, for me, much more easily graspable when I think about the kind of practical, and to Alice's original left hand, kind of detrimental side of the lack of access. And for me, seeing how that worked in terms of the institutions, but also my personal kind of engagement in terms of my career and times which I've either had access or lacked access is very telling for me. And so I think one of the things that kind of segues from the last conversation, there's a big institutional problem, and I'm sure Jenny would tell you the same, is that, you know, we have this ivory tower effect in science, which is only certain people will get certain grades and go to certain schools and have certain opportunities end up where I am, right? And end up getting, say, a PhD in neuroscience. And that's becomes a very stratifying thing, right? Because, you know, I want more people to have access to that, but they don't. And then even when you get to the level of, say, being in a room with people who are scientists, sometimes even policymakers, educators, etc., speaking about the intersection of work from psychology and neuroscience, either within psychology and neuroscience, or say how that impinges on education or policy, etc. You know, in those conversations, which, you know, thankfully I've been able to be a part of in context before, you know, one of the things I think about a lot and try to do but fail, to Alice and Jenny's point, is to recognize who speaks in those spaces, right? And part of why it's poignant for me is that I'm a Black man, right? So I know very clearly that people are always kind of surprised when I show up in that space, and that when I speak, I actually make sense, you know? And so, and one of the things that's really interesting about intersectionality is, you know, the male-bodied person who, as a Black person, interacts with other male-bodied people in a certain way. There is an intersectional difference where I'm allowed to speak, or people listen to me more in some context than any woman, even a white woman, right? And that's really weird to me, to have that be a difference of access in terms of who's listened to, who's not talked over in a space, right? And for me to think about what am I doing in that space to counter that, or to either implicitly or explicitly facilitate it. So one of the things I try to do is to get people who are not speaking to get them to speak, but not by forcing them, because it's not me. I'm not the arbiter of you speaking. If you don't want to speak, you shouldn't speak. But if you're trying to speak and you're being talked down, then, you know, I try to say, hey, you know, blah, blah, was trying to say something. Let's let them finish your point. And that is one example of, you know, kind of practical everyday access to having your position be respected, having your thoughts appreciated, having your kind of person more respected. And I think, the second thing I'll say in terms of, these mechanisms, kinds of ways, the formats or structures around access is, now I'm thinking a lot about the access to health and healthcare services, who gets to like be a biohacker. This is a very popular thing now in San Francisco, is, using your genomic biological data, sleep, Fitbit, wearable data, all these things, even phone usage data. There's so much you can do to try and like improve yourself, improve your health. But that's a very specific market, and there's usually paywalls. There's usually a barrier to entry based on cost, right, and resources. And that's not fair to me. I think that, our data are harvested for all sorts of things without our consent, without real informed consent. I know we sign the agreements without reading them, so we give away our data a lot. And I really want to not give these companies access to us, to who we are, and to our data, to our private information, without actually giving real consent. And I want to take back that information so that we can access it, we can actually harness it for ourselves, and so we can democratize health by, for instance, using data that doesn't need you to have a health insurance, or doesn't need you to go and get expensive tests, that doesn't need you to have certain infrastructure in place. If we can actually get at health patterns and make discriminatory and like real predictive modeling work in a way that we can actually get people to understand their own lives and patterns and health, and actually to democratize that. I think that would be huge. So I'll stop there in terms of, that's kind of the two main things I want to touch on there, but obviously there's more.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Alice?
I just want to take my left hand and my right hand and be like, yes, yes, great. The politics of everything you just said. What does it mean to have moved through those spaces, to have quote unquote achieved in those spaces, and then to have that interpreted with the value that being interpreted, and to be quote unquote listened to. Yeah, I hear and resonate across that with very many similar experiences in educational patterns. And as a professor, when you show up as the professor in the room, I used to actually start my classes by pretending to be a student and just go and sit as a student, because the visual context of me as a professor doesn't work according to the structure. Can I pick up on that and say that is also how I start access? Like, what are the mechanisms and methodologies or format of access? I'm really deeply indebted to the disability justice leaders here in San Francisco and across the United States, who are separate from the disability rights leaders. And I'm deeply, deeply indebted to the formulation campaign for access being love. As that moves across from the disability justice movement to my work in what I will call the disability arts movement, when we say access is love, that means access begins in community, in conversation, in discussion, in process from the very beginning. Right? It's not something that happens, 2 weeks before the show. It structures the research for dance work. It structures the conversation, the imagination, the growth of the work from the very beginning. It's not just how do you send out your MailChimp newsletter? Did you get the alt text in? It's way before that. It's in the creative process. It's in who you call to talk about the work. It's who you share the idea with. It's seeded from the very beginning. And it's with a group of all of us that we go forward, because all of us can be listened to much more easily than one. And
Well, I'll pick up on the access begins with love point, which I love, and say that, and linking to what Craig was saying too, I want to, I think access does begin with love, and actually we need to think about data in that respect. I mean, because we have these like body doubles being created for ourselves, our data, right? And now, just like our bodies, these corporeal bodies are being asked to be able to enter into spaces. Now we're in this interested in our body doubles in the form of data getting access. And that's a whole thing that we could have a whole deep conversation about. I'm just going to give you one example of how that works in non-obvious ways. And I'm going to think here with disability activist educator Patty Byrne about this, who was in this. I highly recommend this documentary Fixed that Reagan Brashear created. And this is all about how, for these new genomic technologies, that we're pushing for access to them. Everyone should be able to get access to their own individualized precision medicine, right? Or otherwise it's exclusionary. But let's think a little bit more deeply how this works. So if we push for this, there's the obvious point of what we're not pushing for. So this is my point about how access is always exclusionary. So if we are insisting on access to the bio data, and then what are we not putting what is not becoming the shiny new object of access? So we privilege the bio data, but then we do not push for access to basic healthcare, for example. So that's just a very crude example, but let me give you a little more complicated example. There's these new RNA therapeutics that are being developed, messenger RNA. This is different from the genome editing that you've been hearing about. Maybe this is not like snipping your DNA and permanently altering the germline. This is changing the messenger RNA, which is the molecules that take the DNA and make them into protein. And when they have errors, then there are a lot of diseases associated with that. So now there's this push to address messenger RNA. Messenger RNA is getting its moment. RNA is getting its moment. We all now know about them through the vaccines. Pfizer and Moderna were messenger RNA. And it is this exciting new realm, this new platform for access, actually, who gets access to these. But let's think it through. If we start creating these new, messenger RNA therapeutics, then one question we have to deal with is California, for example, and Iowa. These are two states that have where you have access to getting your DNA tested in a prenatal state. So prenatal testing is available to all citizens in California and in Iowa. However, if you start adding on, the question will be, should you add on these new mRNA conditions onto the platform that everybody has access to for prenatal testing? Ask yourself, what is the outcome of a prenatal test for mRNA for these types of diseases? Well, often the thing that you're doing is aborting. That's the one thing you can do for a prenatal test. So giving access to those sorts of things can, in a weird way, end up having eugenic effects. And so these are the kinds of weird things that start to happen that disability activists have been really good at calling out. Like, we are building a world in which our very bodies are being voted as, shouldn't even come into the world, right? And it's seen as being easier, less expensive, like you don't have to do all the stuff that Alice was talking about, because we just don't produce those kinds of bodies. And that is where we get into a really, I think, contentious space. And those are issues that we're barely beginning to, I think, comprehend around these new technologies, how it works. I don't think anyone wants to think that they're being eugenic, but there are ways, in unanticipated ways, in which these things start coming in to invoke my colleague Troy Duster in through the back door. Speaking of doors, since we're talking about access.
Yeah, can I respond to that, Jenny? You said so many things that, again, we could spend a lot of time on, but there are a couple of things that really resonated with me and I wanted to bring up. One, to talk about data and access to data. A really big bioethics conundrum right now is if you, for instance, use a certain sequencing technology to determine your haplogroups to get your ancestry, right, to get your percent this, percent that. Those companies now have that data, and the question becomes, what can they do with that now that they have access to it? I personally have chosen, even though I'm fascinated to know the answer, to not actually engage those technologies because of that privacy issue. I'm not comfortable them having and doing whatever they want with my genome, right? So I think that's one thing that I grapple with personally, and I don't think there's a right answer. I'm not trying to say anybody who has done that is doing anything wrong. It's just a personal choice based on my own comfort level with that level of access, right? The other thing I want to touch on is we start talking about mRNA technologies. So right now, I think a very relevant conversation is, as the vaccine rollout is happening, the conversation around access and who is choosing to engage with it, meaning who wants to get vaccinated, who doesn't want to, and particularly the history of some things that were already brought up in terms of testing, in terms of violence through institutional violence through things like healthcare systems, right? So I've been having a lot of conversations with my Black and brown friends, particularly the ones who are quite wary of this technology. And they're not the only ones. A lot of people, because of the first level of access to information, I think they don't really understand what this technology is. And so they don't want to really engage with it, right? And I think that's really unfortunate from the perspective of, we had like a year to get this right, to get the rollout properly happening, which is not happening really in the way it should be. It's not being efficient. They're wasting doses. People don't know where to go. But even just on a fundamental level, I think a lot of people don't really understand the technology and are afraid of it. And I think that is unfortunate. And why couldn't we have better access to information, better PSAs around this? Because I would say most people don't. If you ask them what is an mRNA vaccine, they couldn't tell you, right? And a lot of those same people are pretty wary. And I think particularly when you add and intersectionally the effect of distrust of the government, distrust of the medical system in Black and brown communities, like a lot of people don't want to get the vaccine. And that's bad. I think we should all be getting it. As a Black person, I am going to get it and I will promote people getting it. But, I'm only one person. This needs to be top down. It can't just be me and my friends talking about this. I think that, how people engage in information, how the systems shape the way in which people engage in information, particularly public health information, is so fascinating and can be so problematic because of the history of how these things were handled. And so, I think that's one big problem in terms of, public health issues, access to the vaccine, who can get it, who chooses to get it, that I want us to, not us here, but like us as a society to get better about it, because we really need to right now.
One question and reflection that's coming up for me listening to this is this thread that's been coming through around accountability, and something that you said, Jenny, around people not understanding, and Craig also said people don't understand, and we don't want to be eugenic, but it's happening. And I guess it kind of lights the fire in me, maybe brings the tension in a way that Alice was saying, that I'm really tired of this loosey-goosey sense that discrimination is just a mistake, that somebody didn't understand and that now we need to just correct it. Like, I don't think it's a mistake that doors are designed and some people can't go through. And I don't think it's about understanding what kind of modification could be made to make it seem like you tried. Where do we start the clock on this decision-making around access? And when I think of the direction of access that it flows, I think about who's accountable, yes, but also who's payable, like who's paying the price. And my experience of access is it's something that those who don't have are supposed to go out and get. And if they can't get it, it doesn't matter if it's their fault, but they're the ones who pay the price. So I don't know, I guess I just want to like put a little challenge to these larger ideas of some of these incredible injustices, to ask if that resonates with any of you, or what's happening in your field around just trying to just maybe start facing that we're not just living in a house that built itself.
Yeah. Thank you, Julie. Can I jump in on that? You know, I want to speak briefly to two worlds, the world that I actually live in and the world that I work in as an artist. And they're intersecting, but they have two different formulations. For the world that I live in, no, this did not just happen. We know there is an intentional history of eugenics and eugenic practice. We know that. We can trace it back. And we can also trace it back to understand how disability and race were intertwined by white supremacy to enforce each other. We can also try and trace it back to find at the moments of points in which ableism supports racism and racism supports ableism, and both together support white supremacy. This is not intentional. It's not. It's not that, the point is when the things become legible, right? So that movie, the Fixed movie, is what, 2014? That wasn't new. That wasn't new. People knew that. I remember my first encounter with that set of ideas being in 2000, because I remember the moment and the argument I had about it and the friendship I lost over that. This is not new. It's just that it became legible. And I was late to the party. No, this is intentional. We know that. What we don't know is how to change it while also doing reconciliation and restorative work simultaneously.
I can respond to that. So I think two questions that I'll touch on that I think because we're running out of time, won't really talk about explicitly, but that I think are relevant kind of in what you said, Julie, are like how I think one
Wherever.
so I think the question I was thinking about is, what's one of the greatest challenges in your field, and how would you envision a world where access was more equitable, to paraphrase? And I think for me, one of the greatest challenges, to your point, Julie, is that people don't want to recognize the way in which all systems, all institutions are built on exclusion, built on prejudice, right? And it's like the very fabric of our society. In much the same way, it's the opposite of what Alice said earlier, where she said, the invisible thread that connects us is access. Well, it can also be the exact thing that divides us, right? And I think for me, one of the challenges is when I talk to people about my work, when I talk to people about their conceptions of things that relate to my work. So thinking about yourself and your beliefs, your emotions, your thoughts, people don't want to, for themselves, think about the fact that these are systems that were put in place to make you believe certain things to be truths about yourself that you haven't challenged. And even when you study them, the people who are studying it are not studying it in a way that are truly challenging certain conceptions. And you see that borne out so many times, for instance, as one small example, in the way people talked about intelligence and IQ testing and how flawed that dialogue was for so long, right? Because nobody was willing to challenge a very fundamental misconception, which is that white people are smarter than other people, right? And that was just something that was baked into the way that conversation was had. And there was never something that was challenged for so long. And so that for me is exactly to your point, Julie, is that this is not a mistake. It's not that this accident, oops, this just happened. No, this was intentional. This was systemic. right? And so, the world I would like to see is one in which we are deconstructing these things. But when you ask how and if people are doing this, I would say no. For the most part, no. Like, people are like deathly afraid to engage in this hard work, and the personal and the professional level. In fact, there's stats showing that it could be career suicide on a professional level to engage with this too much, right? So then the question becomes, how do you change things if that's the case? If nobody wants to work with you, what do you do? And I don't have the answer. I'm just gonna say that, but I don't have any pithy, responses to like we can change the world. Like, I don't think so, but it's a problem, and at least we start by asking the question. So, thank you for posing that question, because that's exactly the kind of deep question we need to be asking.
And I just want to say that, I've spent 30 years in genomics, and, unfortunately, a lot has not changed. And your point about professional suicide, if you want to try to do it, I think is an important point, Craig. I mean, this is the problem, I think, of liberalism and our delusions, and our need to feel like we're good people, and the need to feel like we're anti-racist, that we're all like, pro all the things that we should be pro. And then when someone points out that we're not, then it's like the end of our psychological worlds. And I think that we really are inhibited by that is built in deeply structurally, what Alice was saying about white supremacy, like that is deep and old and powerful. And we would hope in 2021 that it was better than in 1981. And maybe it's marginally better, but it is still a huge amount of work to be done. And it takes a huge amount of courage, and it takes institutional vision and the courage of leaders, institutional leaders. One of the things we're struggling with, I think, in the academy right now is so much of the impetus is coming from our students, grad students, but it has to come, as you said, Craig, I think, has also come from the top. The leadership has to be willing to be there too. And we can't just be like, oh yes, our students, it has to be at all levels that this change happens. And the higher you get up in the institution, the more you get invested in like what it's doing, and you're making a nice salary off of it, so it's harder to challenge it. You have less to lose when you're at these other, when you're a student, as it were. So, there are, Julie, your point is, very well taken. It's hard, and it isn't, to your point too, it isn't just misunderstanding. And I think this is the problem that we have with how we respond to people who resist the vaccine, that somehow they misunderstood. Now we are living in an age of misinformation. So don't get me wrong, there is a lot of misinformation. But on the other hand, there's a lot of informed people out there. So there's a question about what information counts. And so this is, I think, a really important point that we also have to address.
Yeah. I really am so thankful for all the ways that we talked really practically and also very philosophically, and allowed for the sort of oscillation between different levels of this conversation in each of your stories and fields and perspectives. And thank you for engaging the last spontaneous question from me. I think that access is not neutral, and I didn't want to leave it hanging too much in the air of a unhad question that I have around justice, I guess, as you brought into the conversation, Jenny. But we are at time here, and the conversation has been deep, and I will be reflecting on it for a few hours, I imagine, and hope to see people at the workshop that is happening tomorrow morning to continue the experience. And some of these same threads will be in that experience as well. It'll be more of a workshop on site-specific performance making and responding to environments as material, cultural, and historical context. So related to some of the themes of today's conversation. Thank you all for joining from home. Thank you for people on Twitch. Thank you so much to our conversationalists, Alice, Jenny, and Craig. Have a good afternoon, folks. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having us, and
Jenny.
thanks for the discussion to all the panelists. It was great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.